All right. Let that be a warning to those of you who don't read your emails or come early enough and only find out right before you come out here that they need an interesting fact about you. And so while previous speakers' facts are about how an entire nation voted them the leader in exile, or they flipped many seats in the North Carolina, mine is about being assaulted by poultry. I also, one other correction, it really wasn't me, neither me nominated for the Nobel Prize nor me single-handedly doing anything. I have the privilege of leading an organization and have hundreds of colleagues around the world who were credited with, in the case of Burundi, the Hutu and Tutsi journalists who started the first multi-ethnic staffed radio outlet in the Great Lakes region of Africa, who were credited with preventing genocide as the genocide was going on in neighboring Rwanda, and similarly with the US-Iran nuclear accord, or the JPEC accord. So anyway, quick corrections. I'm going to make some of the comments that I was originally intending to, but I sat here during the morning, and it's really interesting to me to have heard Pablos speaking at a very personal level about how we each choose what we're going to be active on, and then hear Kate talk about what a real interesting and compelling and inspiring strategy for how we can address what's going on in our domestic politics. And then the last couple of speakers talking at the level of geopolitics. And so I'd like to take a stab at trying to draw a through line between these things. If you looked at those charts that Pablos was sharing in the morning of these trend lines that demonstrate that in many ways we're living in the best time in recorded history. He could have shown many other charts, disease eradication, literacy rates. He showed child mortality rates. You could look at rates, expansion of human rights, expansion of women's rights and women's role in the public square. All of those would have shown not only significant but unprecedentedly rapid improvements beginning around the middle of last century until the turn of this century, right? And I would make the case that the reason for that is because all of that progress was built on a really fundamental foundation that was institutionalized in the form of the United Nations and other multilateral institutions, but that really comes down to a belief that we only really came to after killing almost 100 million of one another during World War II, which was captured by Kate's slogan, that we arrived together or not at all. For those of you who were at the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks, as I was, you saw this sort of pillar organization for all of its faults, and I used to work there, really being attacked from some of the primary powers in the world, and the principles upon which that institution and that foundation was established in the late 40s. And in the hallways, people talking about things like, well, how can we reinvigorate support for this multilateral system? Maybe we should really try to remobilize support for the human rights standards and principles that are captured in different compacts, et cetera. Maybe we should focus ourselves around the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and maybe we should narrow them to a smaller number around which we can really generate the multilateral support that we need in order to succeed. And my feeling is that the challenge before us is much more fundamental. That all of those results, those compacts, those conventions, all came about because there was, for a moment in history, a belief in Kate's slogan, right? We had to, unfortunately, go through such devastation of World War I, supposedly the war to end all wars, and then just some years later, multiples of that many people killed in World War II to finally generate the political will and the popular support to say, you know what, we need to establish a better way to first and foremost prevent war, and secondly, cooperate on everything else to address our common problems. And that belief, I think, is really faltered at every level. And so as I was in those conversations during the UN General Assembly, I kept feeling that, you cannot reinvigorate a multilateral system or a system of global governance when governance at every level under that is fragmenting. We get the global governance that reflects what's going on at our national levels, at the level that Kate's activating on at the state level, not just in this country, but around the world. And when I spoke here last year, I was asked to talk about polarization. And I showed charts demonstrating that, with the exception of Europe leading up to World War II, every region of the world was experiencing higher levels of polarization than they had ever experienced dating back to 1900. And that with the exception of Europe leading up to World War II, every region of the world was experiencing a 15-year increase in polarization that was faster and more rapid than at any other time in history going back to 1900, except again, Europe leading up to World War II. So I shared those things last year. I shared some thoughts about what we could do about it. And those thoughts were very much reflected from what my colleagues and peers and partners in more than 40 countries around the world have done to try to prevent war or help countries emerge from war and not slip back into it. If you saw the New York Times yesterday, I think it was Tom Edsall who wrote a piece in which he called the concern for polarization quaint in the face of rising authoritarianism and increasing conflict. And you hear this a lot. I'm sure you might get this, Kate, when you say we all have to arrive together, where people say, look, all this concern about bridge building and polarization is really a way of sacrificing justice on the altar of civility. There are fights to be fought. It's time to man the barricades, and we need to confront. You know, and you hear this from your social media feeds all the way up to Taiwan-Chinese relations, right? I think there is a necessary third option available to us that is neither go to war nor simply capitulate. And the danger of war that I just want to share with you, maybe this is obvious, but as Pablos was saying, hey, look, you know, take out a sticky and write down all the causes that are meaningful to you and try to prioritize them. You know, if I could physically suck all the oxygen out of this room like that, whatever you wrote down would immediately become completely irrelevant to you, and you would do everything to get the hell out of this room. And that's what violence does to communities. It destroys everything else and all the progress that may have been gained, even over decades. If the war between Russia and Ukraine ends tomorrow, if Israel withdraws fully from Gaza tomorrow, we are talking about a generation, generations that will take to rebuild what has been lost, not, and let alone everything that will never be rebuilt and the lives that can never be gained back. So the alarm bell that I want to ring on this is I agree with everything that Pablos was saying about these trend lines. Unfortunately, what we're seeing on so many of those trend lines, if you look at the last 20 years, is as that foundation upon which all of that progress was built has started to falter. As we've started to see for the first time since 1950, an increase in levels of violence. We had a pretty precipitous drop in levels of violence for more than 50 years. We're seeing a lot of those other gains also backsliding. Whereas we went from less than 20 democracies in the 40s to more than 100 recently, we're seeing that backsliding. Women's rights backsliding. We're seeing a lot of the progress backsliding, right? And so we have to find a way to reinvigorate that commitment to Kate's slogan. I'm going to keep going back to that because that's the most fundamental thing. If you agree, and you know, I would say that without being sort of flip about it, you know, we are living just a few. I think it was 2021 when that tanker ship turned sideways in the Suez Canal for like 6 days, and literally prices of groceries went up in Kansas and Sheffield and Mombasa and all over the world because one ship turned sideways for 6 days. The notion that we actually can secure our own safety, security, dignity, and we can thrive at the expense of the other that's what's quaint. And yet leaders are increasingly trying to sell us a bill of goods that says the best way to secure our future is to destroy the other side, literally or physically. And we're seeing that in our politics locally, domestically, and internationally. So what do we do about this? About a month after I was on this stage last year, I went to visit our team in coastal Kenya, in Mombasa, and I met a Pentecostal minister, Abarija Kinoga, I believe was his name. Very imposing man with a very gray speckled beard who was part of this interfaith council along coastal Kenya, the Swahili coast of Kenya, that our team has been working with for many years. And I asked him very innocently, I said, you know, can you tell me about how you got involved in this work? And he said, let me tell you a story. He said it was 1999, and it was the period of some of the worst interfaith violence in this region. And I was summoned to a meeting with Muslim leaders. And I almost didn't go because I was so furious about what was happening. But I decided to go, and I opened the meeting by saying, if one more church is burned down, I'm going to have 5 mosques burned down. And as he said this to me and my colleagues that I was with, he leaned in and he said, and let me tell you something, I could have done it. There are a lot of people here who listen to me. But I then had to sit there and listen to the Muslim leaders talk about the dehumanization and the discrimination that they were facing, the fears that they were confronting. And we couldn't agree to anything that day except for one core agreement, which was that we would do everything we could to try to prevent atrocities from our community against the other communities. Just a few months later, he said, there was a death threat against me, and I was warned about it by one of the Muslims I had met at that meeting, and I was protected as a result of it. And that really deepened my trust. And we now, fast forward decades later, this Interfaith Council is not only held, but it's expanded to include all the faith communities. It's a very vibrant council. It has prevented violence. It has prevented politicians from dividing those communities in order to gain votes. It's prevented the kind of polarization upon which authoritarianism can rise up, right? Or violence can take hold. And there are a couple things, and I have the privilege of sitting in a place where I could literally tell you over 100 stories of examples like this that lead to things, that support things like the Iran nuclear accord, or that lead to, just this year, the end of a 101-year-old border dispute, which probably maybe nobody's heard about, but between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, after years of support for that effort. So from those examples, I'll just share a couple thoughts. One is that whatever the cause it is that you're trying to advance, in a world where, whether we like it or not, we really are very mutually vulnerable. That doesn't mean we all suffer equally. There's power in the world, and some people suffer a hell of a lot more than others. We know that. But in that kind of world of interdependence, the kinds of leadership that can really deliver change are what we call multipartial teams. Teams that are not impartial or neutral, but they're like Bishop Kanoga and the Muslim leaders he sat across from, where they each have real credibility and constituency in their own communities, but they've made a commitment to do something together. Even if they can't agree on anything else, maybe they disagree on 50 things, but they agree on one, they're going to work together on that one. And if and when that succeeds, it not only addresses a core concern they have, but it deepens the trust between them and expands the areas that they might be able to cooperate on tomorrow. All of the examples of the work that our organization has either done or supported others to do follow that model. You identify communities and coalitions that collectively have a unique credibility because they reach across dividing lines. So those multipartial coalitions are critical. Second, in order for them to really be powerful, you have to move from talk to action. I've never seen so much dialogue as there has been in this country, particularly after the January 6 riots a few years ago. And it's great. And I love the organizations that do it. And I know that if we put too much weight and hope on dialogue, people will get very cynical very quickly. If Bishop Kanoga had participated in that meeting and then there was another atrocity committed just days later by the very community he had just talked with, he would have been out, or vice versa. They would have been out. And so there has to be action across dividing lines that actually meets people's core interests and concerns. So multipartial teams driving collaborative action as a way to build trust. And finally, I want to say one last thing about power. You know, it's very easy for me to sit here and say this, and I would never urge others to take this up if they don't feel like they should, or they're, particularly if they're on the receiving end of power dynamics. Our last two speakers are confronting a huge power imbalance, right? So I would never be preachy of what approach to take. What I've seen from leaders that have really inspired me is an adoption of something we call aikido politics. So for people who don't know, and I don't know aikido, so there may be an aikido master in the audience. Don't correct me if I'm wrong, just make me look good. But the goal of aikido, as I understand it, is really profound. It's to get both you and your attacker to a safe place. Right? To get both you and your attacker to a safe place. If you go on YouTube and you watch an aikido master, they never hit anybody. They're constantly deflecting the blows. Sometimes they're flipping their attacker. They're exhausting their attacker, right? But they're committed to getting to a place that is safe for everybody. And the leaders that have most inspired me are the ones who have suffered persecution, but have insisted that the place they want to get to is not to just flip the power dynamics, but to get to a place that frees all of us. And that's the kind of leadership that we need more of in the world, that is based on a commitment and a belief that we're all going to get there together, or none of us are going to arrive, right? And so that's the kind of activism that we support, that we'd like to see, and that is in the power of every single one of you to adopt on whatever, I'm not trying to convince you that, peace building should become your primary cause. If your primary cause is anything, I'm sure it's worthwhile. I would humbly suggest that you consider who's critical to this changing, including those I most disagree with, and consider whether you might be able to form a multipartial coalition to build trust across those dividing lines and begin chipping away until you can really drive profound change. Thank you. So Letha is telling me that we have time for any questions or comments, so happy to take anything. Yeah.
So if you could fix the UN. If you could pick a topic for the UN and you had only one, and you said this is what the UN should focus on, what would that be at this point in time?
You know, I think in many ways, sort of my answer is sort of my talk. I would really listen to each of the players with one thought in mind. What is the one thing where that Venn diagram overlaps between their interests and their concerns? And let's get them cooperating on that, right? If you want to talk about structural reform, I think clearly, you know, we've had, you know, a UN Security Council that doesn't have any permanent representation from the vast majority of the people in the world is a problem. So if you're talking about a structural reform, I would love to see that council expanded to be more representative. Or as the Finnish president said, if you watched his talk during the UN General Assembly, that there would be, you would be stripped of your ability to use that veto if you're violating some of the norms and standards upon which the whole institution is established. But I think really fundamentally what we need, and I think we need this at every level, is the ability to, rather than see each other as the biggest problem, identify problems that we agree on while understanding the differences, not papering over the differences. You and I can sit together and say, I really, not only do I disagree with you, I'm actually offended by your views. I don't know you, so I'm just on a number of issues, but we both are worried about the school is unsafe for our kids. We're going to do something on that, and we'll see where that leads us. I'm seeing a lot of hands, so yeah, go ahead.
Good morning. Thanks again for being here. We enjoyed your talk even last year. I'm curious to how much you see the current conflicts as representative of a battle of ideas or a contest of ideas upstream that did not succeed, was proved fruitless, et cetera, as maybe that as sort of a domain of solution, particularly given AI, versus trying to people work out and cherry pick things where they might find commonalities.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Sure. Like every contest of conflicts and what have you could be seen as a battle of ideas that was not otherwise fruitful. Like, you didn't hear my side, I didn't hear your side, et cetera, et cetera. I would go so far with the recent shooting, like, if the arguments would have worked, he would have used those instead of a bullet, like, regardless of what we think the situation is. So do you see an opportunity inside the battle of ideas, particularly of AI or other things? Like, there's a thing upstream now that humanity never had before, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I had the I had the privilege of meeting with political leaders who I really respect separately, and who both said something that I'll never forget. This was less than 2 years ago now. I might have even referenced this last year. I don't remember. My apologies if I did. But I talked to both Barack Obama and Jacinda Ardern. You know, Ardern had been prime minister in New Zealand when she was like, I don't know, 35, 37, something ridiculously young. And they both talked really powerfully, and they're both on the political left, clearly, but they're two of the more effective political communicators of my generation growing up, and they both talked really powerfully to me about how the degree to which they had failed to unify their countries, even though they thought they had run as unifying candidates and they thought they had governed in a unifying way. Obama shared that the Republican pollster Frank Luntz told him that the single speech that polled across partisan lines in this country more than any other was Obama's speech on the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. But as Obama was retelling me this story, he said, but I bet if you poll those same people now, just a few years later, I bet half of them think I'm the Antichrist. And Ardern was saying that she was convinced that it was less. I was thinking about this when Kate was showing the data of where people agree. She said she's convinced that on some of the issues that her administration was trying to advance, there was a very small percentage of New Zealanders who were against it, in some cases less than 5%. But she said they were so effective at sowing misinformation and fear and division that they convinced the population that it was polarized, and it became such. And so I guess one of the things I don't want to put, and they're technologists and brilliant folks, Pablos and others here, from what I am seeing and from my peers around the world, while there is in theory and sometimes in fact a really powerful bridging and cross-party mobilization capacity with the online and interactive technologies and platforms that we have now, the conflict instigating and the polarization driving impact of those platforms is overwhelming by comparison. And trying to address that is like throwing sandbags in front of the tsunami. And so, to your question, I think the way that we share information, where we get information, where we form relationships, how we mobilize, particularly through those platforms, is deeply, deeply part of the problem. I'll share one other example. When we got some funding from a foundation to support 11 different conflict-affected countries to respond to COVID. It was emergency funding. We were in all these countries where conflict dynamics were severe, and they were worried about how these countries were going to be able to respond. And so we were working with the governments and the civil society in these countries. And one of the things that we looked at is why are some people sharing misinformation, seemingly patently clear misinformation about the pandemic. And what we found is that in a lot of cases, they didn't even believe it, but they hated the government that was sending this out, so they were going to send this out. It was very tribal. And we see a lot of that today as well. So a lot of the rational argumentation about why are things happening, is this a battle of ideas, I think at a much more emotional level and a much more, this is why polarization, I don't like how fuzzy the term polarization is. The way that we understand polarization is when one side sees the other as an existential threat. If you think of it that way, if that's your definition, then there's no such thing as positive polarization. It is, that's the next step towards violence. And so I think that in a lot of our politics and through a lot of our information platforms and the ways in which we interact with one another, we are feeding that. I wonder how many people, when Pablo says, hey, write down what you think the biggest problems are, I think increasingly people are going to start writing down each other. Or if they pick an issue, they're going to say the way I'm going to tackle that issue is to find everyone who agrees with me and go to war, literally or figuratively, with the other side. And whether we're seeing each other as the problem or we have an overly adversarial approach to driving the problems that we do care about, I think that's the more fundamental issue than really these just rehashed ideas that are playing out. So that's my. I don't know if I addressed your question well, but.